Hey everyone, welcome back. We're going to be diving into some pretty classic political science and sociology today.
Oh, yeah, some really foundational stuff.
Yeah. So are you ready to explore the work of Gaetano Mosca?
Absolutely, a fascinating thinker.
Yeah, his ideas about power and society, they're still super relevant today, even though he was writing over a century ago.
Right, and I think one of the things that makes Mosca so interesting is that he gives us this framework for understanding how power dynamics work in all societies.
Okay, so it's not just about democracies versus dictatorships.
No, not at all. It cuts across all those different systems.
Okay, so what are some of his core ideas? What are we be looking at today?
Well, his big idea, and this might be a little unsettling for some folks, is that every society, no matter how it's structured, ends up being ruled by a small organized group.
Okay, so like a kind of elite.
Exactly what he calls the ruling class.
Hmm. So even in societies that claim to be democratic, like we always think of ourselves as the people have the power.
Well, Moscow would say that's a little bit more complicated than that.
Okay, so there's still this ruling class kind of pulling the strings behind the scenes.
That's his argument, yeah. And he brings up a lot of interesting historical examples.
Oh, like what?
Well, take China's Mandarin system, for example.
Okay.
They had this very elaborate exam system designed to select officials based on merit.
Right, it was supposed to be like anyone could rise up through the ranks if they were smart enough and studied hard enough.
Exactly, a real meritocracy, but guess what?
But,
Wealth and social connections still played a huge role in who actually ended up in power.
oh, wow. So even when you have a system that's designed to be based on merit, there are still these underlying factors.
Right, and that's where his critique of popular sovereignty comes in.
Okay, so explain that a little bit.
So he's basically saying that the idea that the majority truly rules in any society is a bit of an illusion.
Hmm.
In reality, it's always a minority that ends up at the top making those big decisions.
Interesting. So then how does this ruling class, if they're always a minority, how do they maintain their power?
Well, Mosca says it's more complicated than just brute force or coercion.
Oh,
He talks about this concept of the social type.
okay. I've never heard of that.
Yeah, so this is basically like a set of shared beliefs, customs, and prejudices that kind of define a particular group's identity.
So like their worldview.
Yeah, you could think of it like that their shared culture.
Okay.
And these social types play a huge role in everything from political movements to even the success or failure of invasions.
Oh, wow. So like different cultures clashing.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
So a clash between different social types could actually determine the outcome of a war.
So it's not just about military strength.
No, it's a much more than that.
Wow. Do you have any examples of that?
Well, Mosca talks a lot about how European civilization, with its own very particular social type, influenced the development of other cultures, both positively and negatively.
Oh, yeah. Think about like the age of colonialism.
Exactly. So it wasn't just about military conquest. It was also about imposing a whole new way of thinking.
The new social type.
Exactly,
Yeah.
yeah.
So how did these different social types evolve over time? Like how do they change?
Well, Mosca brings up this concept of mimetism.
Mimetism.
Yeah, so he observed that people tend to imitate the beliefs and behaviors of those around them.
Okay, we see that all the time.
Right, especially those they perceive as being more powerful or successful.
Yeah, so if you want to be like the cool kids.
Exactly. You start dressing like them, you start talking like them.
Okay.
And so over time, you get this kind of cultural osmosis that can actually lead to the transformation of social types.
Fascinating. So we've got these ruling classes, we've got these social types shaping societies. But societies change over time, right? Like there are these big historical shifts. How does Mosca account for that?
Well, he looks at a lot of those transitions, and one that he really dives deep into is the transition from feudalism to those bureaucratic states that we see.
Right, like from the medieval period to the early modern period in Europe.
Exactly.
Big changes.
Big changes. And he makes this really interesting argument that it wasn't primarily driven by economic factors.
Wait, really?
Yeah, I know it's kind of counterintuitive.
Because you would think that economic changes would be like the engine of those kinds of social transformations.
You would think that, right, and a lot of historians have argued that, but Mosca says that if you look at the actual systems of economic production, they didn't really change all that radically between, let's say, the 14th and the 17th centuries when this big shift was happening.
Okay, so if it wasn't economics, what was it?
Well, he focuses on another factor that's often overlooked: war.
War.
Yeah, he argues that the increasing scale and complexity of warfare played a huge role in this transition.
So as wars became more complicated, you needed more organization.
Exactly. And those old decentralized feudal systems where you relied on, personal loyalty and local levies.
Governors as vassals and all that.
Exactly. They just couldn't keep up with the demands of this new kind of large-scale organized warfare.
Okay, so you needed a different kind of state, a different kind of military.
Exactly. You needed a centralized state with a standing army, a professional bureaucracy to manage all of that.
So it's fascinating how war, as destructive as it is, can also be a catalyst for major social and political change.
Absolutely. It forces societies to adapt and to innovate.
So in this case, it seems like it favored the emergence of the bureaucratic state.
Exactly. And remember, when Mosca talks about bureaucratic states, he's essentially talking about the rise of absolute monarchies in Europe.
Right, like Louis XIV in France, the Habsburg emperors.
Exactly. Those are the models.
So they used this new apparatus, this new bureaucratic state, to really consolidate their power.
Exactly. Often at the expense of the nobility, the aristocracy.
So there's this tension there, right? You get a more efficient system, but you also get a concentration of power in the hands of the ruler.
That's a crucial point, and it gets to the heart of, I think, one of Mosca's key insights is that there are always trade-offs involved in these different forms of political organization.
No perfect system.
No perfect system. Now, he also has a really fascinating analysis of how this all played out in England, which, as we know, took a bit of a different path than the rest of Europe.
Yeah, they ended up with a parliamentary system. They didn't have an absolute monarch.
Right, and Mosca points out that one of the key differences is that England, unlike France, wasn't constantly devastated by war during this period.
Okay, so more stability, less upheaval.
Exactly, and that allowed them to kind of focus on developing other institutions.
Like Parliament.
Like Parliament, exactly. And they already had a strong tradition of local self-governance, so it wasn't like they were starting from scratch.
Okay, so they were building on something.
They were building on an existing foundation, and that, according to Mosca, led to a much more balanced distribution of power in England, where the monarchy was constrained by Parliament, by the courts.
So very different outcomes depending on the historical trajectory of each country.
Absolutely. It really shows the importance of context.
It's not a one-size-fits-all model for how societies develop.
Exactly. That's one of his main points. There's no one-size-fits-all. Now, one of the most pivotal events in European history was obviously the French Revolution. How did Mosca view that?
Yeah, I'm really curious to hear his take on that because it was such a dramatic upheaval.
Well, he saw it as kind of a culmination of a lot of those long-term trends that we've been talking about. The shift towards centralized power, the growing discontent with traditional hierarchies, the rise of new social forces.
So it's kind of like this inevitable eruption.
In a way, yes, but here's the thing. Mosca was also deeply critical of how the revolutionaries actually handled the transition of power.
Oh, really?
He saw them as being too radical, too idealistic, too naive about the realities of politics.
So even though he recognized the need for change, he thought they went about it the wrong way.
Exactly. He argues that they were too quick to dismantle the old order without having a viable alternative ready to go.
So they created a power vacuum.
Exactly. And that, he believed, is what ultimately paved the way for Napoleon's rise to power.
Wow, so even a revolution that's all about overturning the established order can end up reinforcing those power structures or even creating new forms of elite rule.
That's one of the big takeaways from Mosca's work. It's a real cautionary tale about how complex social and political change really is. Good intentions can sometimes lead to unintended consequences. But moving into the 19th century, we see Mosca analyzing the rise of what he calls the modern representative state.
Okay, and that's becoming the dominant model for a lot of countries.
Exactly. And this is where his ideas about the balance of social forces really come into play.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
So Mosca saw the representative state, at least in its ideal form, as a way to try to create a more stable and just order by allowing for a wider range of social forces to participate in the political process.
So instead of just having one group at the top calling all the shots, you have all these different groups with different interests and perspectives kind of checking and balancing each other.
Exactly. He believed that this kind of dynamic equilibrium was crucial for preventing tyranny and promoting liberty.
It sounds like he was really trying to wrestle with the complexities of governing these increasingly diverse societies.
He was, and while he saw this representative state as a step forward, he was also keenly aware of its potential pitfalls.
Oh, like what?
Well, he warned about the dangers of corruption, inefficiency, and how public opinion could be manipulated within these systems.
So it wasn't like he thought representative democracy was the end of history, the final solution to all our problems.
No, not at all. He was a realist. He knew that even the best system can be corrupted or distorted,
Yeah.
and he stressed that the success of representative government really depends on the quality and character of both the rulers and the ruled.
Okay, I like that.
But we'll dive into those challenges a little bit deeper in the next part of our deep dive. You know, you're right about that the success of any system, it does depend on the people involved. And Mosca was especially concerned about some of those rising socialist and collectivist movements that were gaining momentum in his time.
Okay, so even though he was advocating for a more, balanced representative system, he was wary of these movements that often claimed to speak for the people.
Yeah. It might seem like a contradiction, but Mosca was always looking for those deeper nuances.
Right.
He wasn't necessarily opposed to the idea of, social justice or economic equality, but he was really skeptical of the idea of absolute equality, which was at the core of a lot of these socialist doctrines.
So like everyone being exactly the same.
Yeah, he argued that this pursuit of absolute equality, however well-intentioned it might be, was just incompatible with the way that societies actually function.
So it's kind of like a utopian ideal
Mm-hmm.
that could actually backfire and undermine the very goals it was trying to achieve.
Exactly. He was worried that these movements, if they gained too much power, could actually end up creating a new kind of tyranny, one where individual liberty and rights would be sacrificed in the name of this collective good.
It's interesting how he was able to kind of anticipate some of the challenges that democracies are still wrestling with today.
Yeah.
Like that tension between, individual rights and the demands of the collective good, or the rise of populism, which can be very, appealing to people, but also can have authoritarian tendencies.
Moscow's really ahead of his time in that sense. He saw how these utopian ideals, if taken to their extremes, could lead to some pretty unintended consequences, even potentially paving the way for new forms of elite rule. He was really worried about swinging too far away from individual liberty towards a kind of collectivism that he thought could really stifle creativity and initiative.
It's that balance, isn't it, between individual freedom and then the needs of the community.
Absolutely. Finding that sweet spot is always the challenge.
Right. And Mosca seems to be arguing that representative government, with all its flaws, is probably the best way to try to strike that balance.
That seems to be his position, that it allows for that diversity of voices and perspectives, but it also recognizes the importance of those individual rights and liberties as a safeguard against tyranny. Now, stepping back a bit, I want to go back to Mosca's analysis of that transition from feudalism to the bureaucratic state that we were talking about earlier.
Yes, let's unpack that a little bit more.
I think there are some key insights there that are worth digging into. One of the things that makes Mosca's analysis so interesting is that he really challenges some of those traditional assumptions about how this transition happened.
Okay, give me an example.
Well, for instance, he kind of downplays the role of economic factors in this whole process.
That's surprising because you would think that economic changes would be, at the forefront of such a major shift in how societies are organized.
You would think so, right? A lot of historians have made that argument. But Mosca points out that, if you look at the actual systems of economic production, they didn't really change that radically between, say, the 14th and the 17th centuries, which is when this big transition was taking place.
Okay, so if it wasn't economics, what was driving this change, according to Mosca?
Well, he emphasizes something that often gets overlooked, the role of war.
War. Okay.
Yeah, he argues that this increasing scale and complexity of warfare during this period played a huge role in pushing societies towards a more centralized bureaucratic model.
So as wars became more sophisticated, you needed a more centralized state to manage them effectively.
Exactly. Those old decentralized feudal systems that relied on personal loyalty, they just couldn't keep up with the demands of this new kind of warfare. You needed a standing army, a professional bureaucracy to really handle the challenges of modern warfare.
It's almost like, war, as terrible as it is, can sometimes be a catalyst for innovation.
It forces societies to adapt and to come up with new solutions, right?
Right.
And in this case, it seems like it really favored the emergence of that bureaucratic state.
So when he talks about these bureaucratic states, he's mainly talking about the rise of those absolute monarchies in Europe.
Exactly. Louis
Yeah.
XIV, the Habsburgs, all those guys.
Right? They were all about centralizing power, creating these elaborate systems of administration.
Right. And Mosca argues that these monarchs, they were really able to exploit these changing conditions of warfare to consolidate their own authority. They built these powerful states, often at the expense of, the old nobility, those traditional centers of power.
So it's kind of like a crisis creates an opportunity for certain groups to increase their power.
Exactly. Moscow was very attuned to those dynamics, those shifts in power. Now, he also provides this really interesting analysis of how this whole transition played out in England, which, as we know, took a different path.
Right. They didn't end up with an absolute monarch. They ended up with a parliamentary system.
Exactly, a more limited monarchy, and Mosca attributes this difference to a few key factors. First, he says that England, unlike France, didn't suffer as much from the devastation of war during this period.
Okay, so they had more stability.
More stability, fewer internal conflicts, which allowed them to focus on developing those other institutions.
Like Parliament.
Like Parliament, exactly, and they already had this tradition of local self-governance.
So they had a foundation to build upon.
Exactly, they weren't starting from scratch.
Right.
And this combination of stability and tradition really created a more favorable environment for the development of a strong parliament. And that ultimately led to a more balanced distribution of power where the monarchy was constrained by those other institutions.
So very different outcomes depending on the specific historical circumstances of each country.
Absolutely, which reinforces Mosca's point that there's no one-size-fits-all model for how societies evolve. Now, speaking of pivotal historical events, we can't talk about this period without addressing the French Revolution.
Yeah, that's a big one. How did Mosca view this massive upheaval?
Well, he understood why it happened. He saw the growing discontent with the monarchy, the rise of these new social forces, those demands for greater equality and representation.
So he recognized the legitimate grievances that were driving the revolution.
He did, but he was also very critical of how the revolutionaries went about trying to achieve their goals. He saw them as being too radical, too idealistic, and ultimately too naive about how politics actually works.
So he thought their hearts were in the right place, but maybe their methods weren't.
Exactly. He argued that they were just too quick to dismantle that existing order without having a clear plan for what would replace it. They created this power vacuum, which he believed ultimately paved the way for Napoleon.
Wow. So even a revolution that's all about, liberty, equality, fraternity can end up paving the way for another form of authoritarian rule.
It's one of those historical ironies, isn't it? It shows you that even revolutions, these upheavals from below, can sometimes end up reinforcing those existing power structures or even create new forms of elite domination.
It's a reminder that social and political change, it's messy, it's complicated. And even with the best of intentions, things can go awry.
Absolutely. Now let's shift our focus to the 19th century, where we see the emergence of what Mosca called the modern representative state. This is becoming the dominant model in a lot of parts of the world, especially in Europe and North America.
And this is where his ideas about the balance of social forces become really central to his analysis, right?
Exactly, because he sees this representative state, at least in its ideal form, as a way to manage the complexity of modern societies by incorporating a wider range of voices and interests. So instead of having power concentrated in the hands of just one group, you have all these different groups with their own perspective checking and balancing each other.
It's like that idea of a marketplace of ideas, right? Where different perspectives can compete and hopefully the best ones will rise to the top.
Yeah, you could think of it like that. He believed that this kind of dynamic equilibrium was really crucial for preventing any one group from becoming too dominant.
Right. So no tyranny of the majority or tyranny of a minority for that matter.
Exactly. It's about trying to find that balance.
So it sounds like he was grappling with these challenges of how you govern these increasingly complex and diverse societies in the modern era.
He was, and while he saw the representative state as a major step forward, he was also keenly aware of its potential pitfalls. He was very concerned about what he called political apathy.
Okay, so what did he mean by that?
Well, he observed that as societies become more complex, more bureaucratic, there's a risk that citizens will become disengaged from the political process.
Right. It's easy to feel overwhelmed or like your voice doesn't matter.
Exactly. And Mosca worried that this kind of apathy could create a really fertile ground for demagogues, those figures who promise these simple solutions to complex problems and prey on people's fears and frustrations.
So you need an active and informed citizenry to really safeguard those democratic values.
Absolutely. And Mosca really stressed the crucial role of education in fostering that kind of active citizenry. But we'll explore those ideas a bit further in the final part of our deep dive into Mosca's work. So we've talked about ruling classes, social types, historical shifts, revolutions, even the rise of these representative governments. What else did Mosca have to say about the complexities of these modern societies?
Yeah. Where do we go from here?
Well, one of the things that Mosca really focused on, and this might seem a little bit obvious, but he was really adamant about the importance of education.
Okay, so in a system where citizens have the power to vote, to choose their leaders, I
Yeah.
can see how that would be pretty crucial.
Absolutely. And Mosca argued that you need a well-educated populace for representative government to function properly. Citizens need that knowledge, those critical thinking skills, understand all these complex issues to be able to evaluate different arguments, to make those informed choices when they vote.
Otherwise, they're just going to be swayed by, the loudest voice or the most charismatic personality.
Exactly, or by propaganda or misinformation, which was something that Moscow was very concerned about.
Mm.
He saw education as a safeguard against those dangers. He warned that, without an educated citizenry, democracies could easily devolve into mob rule or become vulnerable to manipulation by, those skilled manipulators.
Makes you wonder if our current education systems are really doing enough to prepare people for all the complexities of today's world.
It's a question worth asking for sure. Another challenge that Mosca highlighted was this growing influence of special interest groups and how they could potentially distort the political process for their own benefit.
Oh, you'd have a field day with today's world, all the lobbying, all the political action committees.
He'd have a lot to say about that. And remember his concept of the balance of social forces, right?
Hmm.
He argued that for a democracy to function well, you need this kind of diverse ecosystem of groups and interests. They can all compete for influence, but no single one should be able to dominate the others.
Kind of like, a healthy ecosystem in nature. You need that biodiversity to keep things in check.
Exactly. If any one group becomes too powerful, whether it's wealthy elites or corporations or even a particular ideology, it can really throw things out of balance and undermine those principles of fair representation and equal opportunity.
So how do you prevent that from happening? How do you maintain that balance?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It requires a lot of vigilance, both from the citizens and from those in positions of power. It's about fostering a culture of transparency, accountability, civic engagement, making sure that people feel like they have a stake in the system and that their voices can be heard.
Sounds like a constant struggle.
It is, and Moscow was pretty realistic about that. He wasn't a utopian thinker. He knew that power dynamics are always going to be complex and there's always a potential for corruption or abuse. But he also believed that, by understanding these dynamics, we could at least try to mitigate the risks.
So if he wasn't a utopian,
Hmm.
what was his message? What did he see as the path forward?
I think his main message was a call for us to really think about how societies work, to be aware of these complexities of power, to question our assumptions, but also to recognize that, we can make a difference. We can try to create those more just and equitable societies, even if we know that perfection is probably not attainable.
It's like a call to action, isn't it?
It is. He believed that apathy and cynicism were the greatest threats to democracy. So we have to engage, we have to participate in the process, and we have to hold our leaders accountable.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today exploring Mosca's ideas about ruling classes, social types, those historical shifts and power revolutions, the rise of representative government, the challenges these democracies are facing. It's been a real deep dive.
It has been, and while Mosca's work might not give us any easy answers or simple solutions, it certainly gives us a lot to think about.
And I think that's a good place to leave it. So we encourage you to check out Mosca's work for yourselves if you're interested. And as always, thanks for joining us on this deep dive.